That makes a lot more sense.
It's like
You helped us win the
limiting.
war. Now we'll sacrifice the victims of the war you helped us win. Terrible, but I get that.
I get it. Oh yeah, I get a lot of terrible things. Sacrificing your own children, I don't like really.
I can't wait for this to get out. Shaiel justifies human sacrifice.
We're justifying human sacrifice on this show today, kids. How can you integrate this into your religious practices and show results into your culture in the future?
It didn't work for the Aztecs, kids. They ended up losing.
Welcome to the Furrowed Brow with Jeffrey Kipler. All right, here we go. Welcome to the Furrowed Brow. My guest is Shaiel Ben-Ephraim, creator of the History of the Land of Israel podcast. After enjoying 19, actually, I think I'm on 20 episodes now. I think
we have so far, so you're doing well.
Oh yeah, no, I'm up to date. I didn't actually even reach out to you until I was like 19 episodes in. So I was like, I had planned somewhere in the first like few. I was like, I'm gonna reach out to this guy, and then I got to like 19, and I'm like, I still hadn't reached out. I'm like, I really hope he responds to me. This
what a waste otherwise.
Yeah, I was like, I need content, man. I really enjoyed all of your podcasts, and I reached out to you to see if you would be on the Furrowed Brow, and we're really delighted that you accepted. Shaiel's podcast covers Israel specifically, though. What's interesting, it's not just the people of Israel, it's the land of Israel and the various peoples who have inhabited that land over the years, actually starting all the way back with the dinosaurs. And I think his 20th episode now starts talking about the relevancy of the biblical stories of the plagues and whether they actually happened, or how much historical truth there is to that. And yeah, Shaiel, thanks so much for joining me.
Sure, my honor. I love your podcast too. You really have a gift for getting free-flowing dialogue going. That's rare.
I appreciate that. That's what we go for here. A little longer format, and thanks for cutting out, because by the way, everybody, I ask all of my guests to carve out at least 3 hours to make sure that we get sufficient time. So thanks so much for taking so much time out of your day today. So
it's a weekend and there's no football. So
excellent. So you're from Israel, but where do you live now?
I'm in Hollywood.
No kidding.
In Hollywood, yeah, very close to the boulevard. Yeah, I grew up in Jerusalem, born and raised. Went to the army in Israel, undergrad, master's, worked for the Israeli government. But the last 10 years, I've been living in North America.
No kidding. So what brought you over to North America?
My college education, academics. I did my PhD at the University of Calgary. I did fellowships at Harvard and at UCLA.
And what were you studying? Was this all Israeli history kind of stuff?
I started with general international relations.
Oh, okay.
And to be fully honest, it was scholarships that kept pushing me in an Israel direction. Everyone kept offering me Israel scholarships, and it just kind of went from there. And my curiosity as an undergrad was so broad.
Yeah.
But that's sort of where I ended up, because I was willing to sort of look at anything. And then I also had experience in Israeli government. So made research on Israeli international relations much easier. I had access to the primary documents. I knew how it worked. So I kind of ended up there.
Gotcha.
And the ancient stuff that I'm doing now, that's just that's a hobby. I never had formal training in those periods, aside from introductory history courses back when I was an undergrad. But I do have PhD level research tools, so I'm using them on a new period. So every episode I do is so much fun because I'm discovering all this stuff that I didn't know.
Gotcha. So what
journey of discovery?
So, and I definitely want to ask you like how you go about making each episode here. But before we get into that, how did you decide to do the podcast?
I really wanted to do a podcast for a while. Because when you do academic research, you don't really reach all that many people.
Yeah.
Like, I'll give you an example. I have an article. It's considered the, definitive article on early U.S. policy towards Israeli settlements, right?
Yeah.
And how many people have ever read that thing? It's been cited a bunch of times, but like what, 200 people have actually read that in the
Yeah.
entire world? And every single one of my episodes gets several times that exposure. So it's
Yeah.
nice to actually have platform that is meaningful,
Yeah.
that you can connect and reach out to people. And of course, academia has also become caught up in jargon
Yeah.
and fashion. You have to follow, if you're not writing about right now, if you're doing history that's not African American studies
Yeah.
or Native studies, I mean, no one cares, for example. And then there's all the jargon in it. If you don't use it, then they won't publish you. If you use it, no one will read it. So the great thing about a podcast, as you know, is you can make high level knowledge accessible to people. So it was a much better application in many ways of my research
Yeah.
skills than anything I've done before. It's far more rewarding than writing academic work. Strangely enough, I didn't think it would be. There's
Yeah.
no comparison. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's really something to, and I've talked about this on previous podcasts about the I think the Greeks called it, somebody told me, the dialogos, where people would have a conversation about something, and that it's much easier to learn by watching people or participating in that conversation, as opposed to going in and wading through documents where, when they did the printing press, you had the scale of being able to push out all of those ideas to people in mass, that you just, before that it was listening to people speak, right, lectures, but that didn't scale at all. But now that we have the internet and these podcasts, all of a sudden, like, these conversations scale in a way that is just much more effective than they used to be. You can have, and Jordan Peterson talks about this, Joe Rogan's talking about this, you can have the best people in the world on a subject, and you just sitting in where, in Hollywood can participate that in a way. And yeah, that's one of the reasons I got into podcasting, was like, I'm just getting so much out of these conversations that, hell, I want to participate in them. So
Of course, the problem is the democratization of knowledge means you don't know how competent the people who are
well,
giving you the knowledge are.
and I've
And
certainly fallen victim to that before, and still do, I'm sure.
we all do. So if you want to do history, and so many podcasters do this great, have to know how to approach primary documents,
Yeah.
because it's very hard to really learn history from anything other than primary documents, or if you're not basing your research, at least to a great extent,
Yeah.
on primary documents. I mean, I found that when I was doing research on U.S. policy on the settlements, is that everything that everyone says about the topic in secondary sources is wrong,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Well,
just because they never read the documents.
one of your recent tweets actually kind of blew me away, where it was, you were talking about how the Bible talks about Eden becoming created from the rib of Adam, that was you, right?
That was not me.
That was
At
not
least
you.
not that I
Okay, somebody
remember.
was talking about
No.
this. I'm misremembering the source, but it's like, then they went through the etymology of, like, where the what the root word was, and it was something that just meant side. And
That's right.
it was, so okay, so you're familiar with this idea where, like, where if you just took the King James version of it, rib, it doesn't really make sense. But if you think about it as side, God split Adam in half to create Eve, two complementary sides. Not that one was just made from the piece of a rib, right?
That's right. That's right. The generally speaking, the Tanakh, what we call the Bible, or the Old Testament,
Yep.
is a lot less misogynistic than a lot of the Christian interpretations. Not that it's not
Yeah.
misogynistic in many ways, don't get me wrong, but
Well,
some
the
of the
world's
Christian
a little
interpretations are,
misogynistic. It's
the world's a little misogynistic.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, and Judaism took misogyny a step further from its Canaanite ancestors, which is
Okay.
something I'm looking at right now. But yeah, look, we have a serious problem with just accessing what it says in the Tanakh as modern people,
Yeah.
because there's really no way to read it without making an interpretation,
Yeah.
right? So you're talking here about these Christian translations, and Christian translations either knowingly, in the worst case scenario, or
Yeah.
unknowingly, are making the text conform to the New Testament and the idea of looking for the Messiah in the Old Testament, right?
Right.
And meanwhile, but so Jews say, oh, read the Jewish translations. The Jewish translations are better because they're not introducing a ideology that didn't exist at the time.
Yeah.
So they're better in a lot of ways, but they're also taking out a lot of the historical context. Again, knowingly or unknowingly, there's a lot of hints towards, say, polytheism and things like that in the Tanakh
Yeah.
that are removed, sanitized in the official Jewish translations.
Huh.
And then even, I know Hebrew; it's my native language, so I can sort of read it directly. But then is biblical Hebrew a different language or the same language? Are the words interpreted the same or not? I'm also interpreting it in my own way. So we have a serious problem with accessing it, even when you know Hebrew. And if you learn biblical Hebrew, you're usually trained with a certain amount of ideological baggage behind that, whether that's in the university, whether that's in Jewish religious schools. So we have a real problem accessing the text as it was originally written.
Yeah. And I, it's like so I was atheist for like the longest time, and I'd say now I am religious, but probably not in the same way that most people think of religious and belief in God. It seems to me that there have to be truths in these teachings, otherwise they wouldn't get passed down, and survive. But if you accept that, you also have to accept that the teachings themselves have to be based in reality as we observe it, not some idealized sort of version of it. And I feel like one of the things that you're saying here, it's like what comes to me is like, when people say, oh, well, Jesus would have been a socialist or whatever. It's like, well, he was a Jew, and he believed in the Old Testament, maybe was providing a different point of view on some of these things and whatnot. But the idea that all of a sudden he's going to have matched exactly what some people view as idealistically good these days just doesn't seem to hold water to me. It's like you have to think about the fact that this guy was a Jew in the time of the Romans, where the Romans were these like, they were the empire, like coming in to like subjugate things. And like, you've got these people who are like, they're not slaves exactly, but they've got these foreign occupiers there. They got, it's pretty bad. And he's got a different sort of message to help them get through what maybe they were suffering at that time. I don't know. Wait, does that make sense? Does that resonate with you at all?
Sure. I mean, on the one hand, our current political concepts are completely alien to first century Judea.
Right.
There's no relation. The problems they face, the way they conceived of politics, the way they conceived of the economy,
Yeah.
the idea of capitalism, which socialism is a reaction to,
Mm-hmm.
it exists to an extent, but it hasn't really been understood.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and all that. But on the other hand, the only way that people can address what happened then is by looking at through the prism of today.
Mm-hmm.
So no
Yep.
matter how careful we are, how many, I mean, think of any college class you've ever been to or any book you've ever read on this stuff. They will always warn you, it's anachronistic to do this and do that. Then they'll always finish the class or the book with a comparison to today or trying to make it relevant to today after having warned you. And the reason isn't because they're hypocrites, maybe a little bit, but it's because there's really no other way for modern people to look at things except for what they understand.
Yeah.
They say the past is a foreign country, like that
Yeah.
quote. We don't really know what it was like there. We can put ourselves in it to a very limited degree, no matter how much we study it. And at the end of the day, if we want to make it accessible to people, we do have to make the comparisons. So it's kind of sad. It's a little bit like what I said, where the text is not accessible to us. Also, the time is limited accessibility
Yeah.
to us. So you're right about all that. But people on the right do the same thing. People on the left do the same thing.
Oh yeah.
Not necessarily because they're trying to dishonorably win an argument, although there's some of that too. They just don't know any other way to look at it.
Yep, for sure. So bring me through how do you go about creating all these episodes, just so our listeners know if they haven't. I'm sure they'll go out and listen to some episodes. You do about 20-30 minutes for an episode. How much time does it take to put together? What do you do to make those happen?
I aim to go for like 4,000 words, which ends
Okay.
up being a little bit over half an hour.
Okay.
I found that to be good. Yeah, but usually I end up with more rather than less because overwriting is my disease. But how long it takes me to put together really depends on the topic. If I have really good secondary sources, or even better, I have a good collection of primary sources, I can do the whole thing in a few hours,
Oh wow.
like 6, 7 hours. If I'm struggling with finding good sources, and by good, I don't only mean reliable, I also mean interesting.
Yeah.
I want to bring people in some way instead of saying, in this era, the ceramics had this kind of pattern and that kind of sharp edge. There's a limit to how much mileage you can get out of that. So at worst, it can take me a good 24 hours, and a lot of that is finding the right sources. But at the end of the day, uh, the research is usually manageable.
Mm-hmm. So do you set out a topic? You're 20 episodes in. Had you laid out the topics beforehand? Or are you just kind of like, how far in advance are you planning? Like how?
I had a great plan when I first put together the podcast that I've had to completely and totally ignore uh, as I go along, because everything I assumed was wrong. Some things that I thought I would have a lot to work with, I had nothing to work with, and some things that I thought would just be minor ended up
Huh.
being massive. Like for example, I'm doing the Hyksos Canaanites taking over Egypt right now, which I'd always heard correctly, something that they don't have a lot of information about. But it turns out that there's a lot of hidden depths to that topic, especially as they pertain to the Israelites. In fact, what I'm starting to see, this is my pet theory, I'm starting to develop, not completely on my own here, is that the Hyksos, the Canaanites who ruled Egypt, were probably the source of most of the early Israelite stories about the book of Exodus and all of those things. They were the sort of cultural repository of stories about what was happening in Egypt at that time. Since we don't really have archaeological evidence of the Exodus story
Mm-hmm.
as such, but this is around the same time, and they're Canaanites. There's a good chance this is how that information and how those stories emerge. So even though it's not necessarily the most important period in Egyptian history, for the story of the land of Israel, it's central. And I'm already on my second episode of it, and my guess is it'll go on to several episodes. So that's an example of how I've had to completely throw away the plan. And it always
Gotcha.
ends up with you doing more episodes than you expected when you do history. Every history podcast I've ever talked to says the same thing. You're like, I'm going to reach this date by episode 15. No, you're not. You're absolutely not. Unless you're half-assing it, you're not, because there's all these great things that you need to build the story.
Gotcha.
So no plan. There was a plan. It's gone. I'll
So
make
how
another plan, and that'll also be gone.
how long do you think that this is going to go? Like, how far away from, because I would imagine the crescendo is, the Israelis come, the European Jews go to Israel, and you bring us into like modern day. You're still back in the time of Egypt. How long is it going to take you to get there?
These are very difficult questions. It's like asking a woman her age or weight, or I sit there thinking, okay, at this rate, I will be in my 80s.
Yeah, right.
I don't know how to answer that. I know for sure that I want to reach the Islamic conquest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if I'm really sick of it at that point, I may stop there.
Okay.
My guess is I won't, and I will continue to modern Israel. I'm not going to hide my influences. I have like direct influences in this podcast. Basically, okay, I'm basically ripping off another podcast. I'll just
Oh,
say it.
okay.
There's a podcast called the British History Podcast. Um, I absolutely love that podcast. And he's been going for, I don't know, about 8 years.
What is this, like
And
the
I've,
history of the land of Britannia or something like that?
yeah, yeah, he
Okay.
starts at the very beginning and he goes through. And then I was like, oh my God, I'd
Oh,
love to listen to one of these about Israel, about my country.
yeah.
And there's no such thing. You asked where I got the idea. There's no such thing. Not only is there no such thing, there's no such book.
Huh.
There's really nothing that goes from the very beginning until modern Israel. Like the closest thing you have is this, at least that I'm aware of. If anyone knows anything better, let me know. But you have the Oxford Illustrated History of the Holy Land right here. And all this is a collection of chapters by great scholars about different periods. It always starts at the Bible. It's very minimal. And, you know, no one's done the whole narrative.
Why? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that more than any other history, and this is another reason I want to do this podcast. The history of the land of Israel is one of cherry picking and selection of periods
Sure.
because everyone has an agenda regarding it. And if you put together all of the periods, you can't make a meta narrative that supports one claim to the land or one story. You just can't.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I grew up in the Israeli school system, and we learned the Zionist approach to history. Now that makes it sound very indoctrination-y, and it really wasn't.
Hmm.
I have to say, secular school. I don't know what's going on right now. There's new government there. God knows what's happening now. My guess is this is different now to some extent. But when
Yeah.
I was a kid, really it was very haphazard. No one was indoctrinating you. No one was teaching you this land belongs to you. The Arabs are this. It really wasn't like that. It was much more pluralistic back then. But having said that, everyone was teaching you were Zionists, right? So they had that viewpoint. And this is how you learned Jewish history. You had Bible. We were proud. We were free. We were beating everyone. Not historically correct, but okay. We were exiled by the Romans. In the diaspora, we were miserable. We were treated badly. All we did was suffer and pray that we want to come back to the land of Israel. Then we did. We beat the Arabs, and everything's great now, and we're back, baby. That's basically the story that you learn. And it just glosses over the entire diaspora. It also completely ignores everything that happened before Judaism. Then you talk to Palestinian activists.
Yeah.
So they don't really know what to do with the biblical era. Some of them say the Canaanites were Palestinian. Some of them say Jesus was a Palestinian, etc. But they'll focus on the long period
Yeah.
that Muslims were in charge, and it's a long
Yeah.
period. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about well over a millennia. So you can focus on that, and then you start history there. Then the Jews that start arriving in the late 19th century, like where did these guys come from, right?
Yeah.
So you frame history differently. Then you ignore the fact that Zionists have been there now for over a century. So you ignore the fact that that's a long time too, and you ignore that part of the claim. So you're putting history in this particular box. And if you're Christian, then it starts in the Old Testament, right? Continues through to Jesus, the
Yeah.
Crusades, but you ignore Islam, basically, except for the Crusaders fought them. So no matter what you're trying to do with the history of the land of Israel, there's parts that you're just not interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, everybody's on a team, right? And the story and the narrative that you put forward either helps or hinders your team in many ways, it seems.
That's right. And when you get to the history of Britain, it used to be that the British were on the Norman team, right?
Yes. Yeah.
1066 was good. Now they're like, okay, those guys were also our ancestors. The people before 1066, they're also interesting.
Mhm.
So it's much less controversial to go back. And so all the parts of the history, it's also very artificial, but all the parts of history kind of add up to being modern British. So it makes sense there was a British podcast before that. And I've seen books about British history that are like that I don't see about the land of Israel. Because no matter what you're trying to prove, that book will not prove it. And that's basically what I'm trying to show, is that any attempt to say that land belongs to one people is very artificial
Yeah.
and irrelevant. And one of the things I want to highlight, I'm already doing it with the Canaanites and the Amorites and all that, but what I'm really going to focus a lot on is showing all the other people that lived in the land
Yeah.
that are not Jews, not Muslims, not Christians, not part of the big, controversies. Just people from other groups that have been there all along. People always ask, who are the Druze and how did they show up? Who are the Samaritans? And I really want to get into their part. And then there's a political agenda I have too. I'm a two-state solution guy. I'm a
Yeah.
pluralist liberal. And I think that it's important that we see that there's not one group that the country belongs to. So there is an agenda behind it. I just think it's a good one. And my agenda happens to be served by historical reality. Of course, that's what historians always think. So
of course it is.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But I'm just diving in and doing my best. I definitely don't want to show that that it's a Jewish land or that it's not a Jewish land.
Right.
And I am a Zionist, so I certainly have no interest in minimizing the Jewish role.
So just because we've mentioned the names a few times, and obviously not everybody's going to have listened to these episodes, who were the Amorites, who were the Canaanites, and how do they relate to the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Ooh, tough one. Okay. Well, the Canaanites and the Amorites are both very vague names. In both cases, we know what the core of those people are, who are people who can definitely say these are Amorites, they're Canaanites, but it's hard to say where the group ends. That's a matter of great controversy, right? So let's start with Canaanites. Canaanite is a geographical description. So people who are not from Canaan called people from their Canaanites. Everyone who lived there. So it became kind of a way of describing people come from that area. When we say Canaanite culture, what we basically mean is the culture of people who lived in the land.
So this is like Texans.
Yeah, it's like Texans. Okay. Exactly. It's like saying Texans, love barbecue and football. It's kind of like
all sorts of Texans, but they all come from Texas.
Exactly. So you say, Canaanites did this, they did that. What you're basically saying is lots of people who lived in this land did that, or that is at least the stereotype they had in other places. And now we can also base that on archaeological evidence.
Yeah.
And what is Canaan? At its peak, it's all of the Levant almost. It's Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Israel and Palestine. So all of that, and probably stretching into Mesopotamia sometimes. Of course, they had their own cultures. So those are Canaanites, and their civilization basically fades. It fades. The Israelites had something to do with that. The Phoenicians had something to do with that. Or first, they were called the Philistines. Something to do with that with their invasion. The Egyptians had something to do with that. Basically, like their culture fades rather than disappears. And when you're reading the biblical era, what you're seeing is that a lot of what we call Canaanite culture was still there, but people were starting to move in different directions from it. And the Bible is a real example of that. If you look at the Bible, one of the best ways of looking at it is as a way of telling people, listen, these Canaanite traditions are not good. You've got to move on from them. And they weren't the only ones doing that. But Canaanite described everyone living there, including what became the Israelites. So everyone in that area who didn't arrive after 1200 BCE pretty much was a Canaanite. Mostly is a geographic descriptor. Amorites are even more complex story than that. So when we say Amorites, we're talking about a group of nomads who invaded Mesopotamia, coming from Central Asia somewhere, taking over Mesopotamia, and becoming the elites in cities there. The most famous Amorite of all is Hammurabi.
Okay.
So yeah, so then the question becomes, okay, are these just elites, or do the elites running these cities share a culture with the people under them? And the most likely story is probably that at first they were elites, their culture influenced the people underneath them, the people underneath them's culture influenced them, and eventually they became sort of an Amorite uh, union.
Mhm.
When we have documents of Amorites talking about themselves as
Mhm.
Amorites, or people talk about them as Amorites, they're always talking about the elites that ran cities,
Of course. Yeah.
always. And that's why we have a lot of difficulty discerning whether they were Amorite regular people, Amorite middle class. We really don't know. So we have a lot of difficulty with that.
I
We
mean,
know that the
there's just no
yeah.
records of people who aren't elites from those times, right? It's like, I mean, history is the history of the elites, or am I thinking about that wrong?
Yes and no. I mean, the documents are for the elites, written by elites. No one
Mhm.
else could write. But
Right.
what's
Yeah.
fascinating, yeah, but what's fascinating is that a lot of these documents, when we have real archives, this is why I love primary documents, are addressing issues related to common people.
Okay.
So I have a couple of episodes on the Mari archives,
Hmm.
and Mari is an Amorite city, or at least their leadership was Amorite. And we, in the documents there, address what poor people are doing all the time. Like we have, if you listen to the episode, or better yet, um, read the book. I absolutely love this book. I can't recommend it enough. It's Jack Sasson's From the Mari Archives. Now, the Mari Archives, they have like 80,000 tablets. And these are government tablets. Let's get taxes from this guy. Let's arrest that guy. Let's take over this city. Let's assassinate this dude. It's all like that. None of it is intended to be propaganda, or very little of it's intended to be propaganda, which is why it's amazing.
Hmm.
And they talk a lot there about poor people. What are we going to do about this poor person? And sometimes in their own voices. So it's like there's one great document, I talk about it in the podcast, where a king is telling this guy to evacuate this woman from a house that belonged to some rich guy. And he says, "This woman is tough. I can't evacuate her. She said this to me," and he tells how she told him off. And she said this to me, and I was like, "I can't deal with this woman." And he was quoting her, and kind of with respect, kind of with trepidation. And he's really giving you the words of this poor, illiterate woman and her concerns. And you can get that as long as you have the primary documents, and then you cross that with the archaeological evidence, and you can get a window into the lives of regular poor people. Sometimes that's what survives. Sometimes we can't find the palace. Sometimes we find the village.
Mm.
So it's not that we can't do social history. It's not that we can't look at the history of poorer people. It's that it's sometimes more indirect and more difficult.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, okay, so you've got the Amorites, you've got the Canaanites, and do they become the people, the Israel, I shouldn't say Israelis, I should say, do they become the Jews, or like how does that transition happen?
Well, haven't gotten there in the podcast yet, but I'm already reading up on it. But basically, what we're talking about the Israelites are a group of Canaanites that
Yeah.
move in a different religious direction. They're one of the things that becomes very obvious once you read the Canaanite myths, the mythology, and compare it to biblical myths, is that they're coming from the same source.
Yeah.
They have the same cultural lexicon. The people who wrote the Tanakh knew these stories inside out, right? We and um, they're rejecting certain elements of them
Yeah.
knowingly. So there's no question that both geographically and culturally, they're coming from Canaanite society, but they're
Hmm.
part of the disintegration of the hegemony of Canaanite culture.
Okay.
So other groups are moving in different directions. There's a lot of other influences coming in. Um, Israelites are influenced to a great extent by Mesopotamian
Hmm.
religion, to a lesser extent by Egyptian, but they're also doing their own spin on it. One of the criticisms I've gotten from people about my approach, which is close to the academic approach, is that I'm showing that the Bible isn't original, that it's taken from previous myths and from previous books.
Jonathan Pagow and Jordan Peterson make this point across the board. It's like the synthesis of these stories that become, it's like this, none of it's original. It's all these like telling of these old myths and events and so on and so forth. It's the synthesis that is original.
I'd say more than that.
Okay.
I'd say more than that. I've actually had my admiration for the authors of the Bible strengthened by
Yeah.
this exercise, which I wasn't expecting. I was expecting
Mhm.
more along the lines of what you were saying. What I found is that while they live inside the Canaanite cultural milieu, they are very good at turning these legends on their heads, changing them, and giving them completely original voice.
Okay.
And that's one of the remarkable reasons that the influence of those books has lasted so long. There's that, and then the fact that there's a certain universal element to it. There's an originality, and there's universality. So there's a lot of things that are different and are remarkable. Because if you look at Canaanite religion, it's often very local, based
Mhm.
on a specific city. If we looked at Byblos, for example, their main um, was the goddess of the city, and that's very common. The Tanakh at its best has a universal
Mhm.
message as well. So I think there's a lot of originality there, but even the best creator is working within a certain cultural milieu,
Mhm.
and that milieu is the Canaanite milieu, still, with influences from other places. I think one of the reasons that Canaanite culture is disintegrating at this time is because of the pressure the Philistines are putting on them as well. Canaanites never recovered from the invasion of the Sea Peoples in
Mhm.
1200 BCE. That was absolutely disastrous for that culture. They continued to exist for a few hundred years, but it was never the same.
And
So
who are
Judaism,
these sea people? These are Mediterranean people who live somewhere on the Mediterranean.
there's a massive historical argument over where they come from, but honestly, I think it's been settled at this point. They're of Greek origin,
Okay,
Mycenaean origin.
gotcha.
Exactly where in Greece and what, hard to say exactly. Most likely because there were waves. So probably people came from Macedonia, people came from the islands. I think
Right.
that's why there's some confusion about that. But the DNA, the pottery, it's all an offshoot of the Greeks. Before the kind of Greeks that we know and love. I mean, I love anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so they come from there. They bring a completely different culture, and they're also very good warriors. The Canaanites had their moments as warriors, but the Philistines were better, and so that puts the pressure on them. That's where the Jews come from. Amorites are an important cultural influence on Israelites, but it's not the same intimacy. They're in a slightly different region. They're further to the north,
Hmm.
and their intimacy is a lot of it comes from the fact that the Israelites and they share a lot of influences, but it's not the same familiarity as far as I can see. Israelites aren't an offshoot of the Amorites, but the Amorites to a great extent become very identified with the Canaanites, or some scholars believe they are Canaanite elites. That goes back to the previous
Gotcha.
discussion we had. What was the other thing you asked? Or I think there was more. Oh, about the Palestinians, I think.
Oh, gosh, I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll say something about the Palestinians because
Yeah, please.
a lot of people talk about the connection between the Palestinians and these early people. And the bottom line is, look, if you do DNA analysis, and then every time you mention DNA analysis, people jump at you and say you're doing Nazi science or whatever. But DNA analysis is fascinating and
Yeah,
gives you a lot of insights. Everyone who lives in Israel shares DNA with these ancient peoples to
yeah.
some extent. And that goes before the Canaanites. That goes back to the Natufians, the first agricultural people in history, pioneers from the land of Israel. Palestinians and Israelis share Natufian DNA, and so do a lot of other people in the region, like Armenians and Kurds, and most people stayed in the same area their whole lives.
Yeah.
Then maybe they'd move 50 miles. There's a drought, whatever. But generally, and then their children would move, maybe 50 miles back towards the land of Israel or whatever. And all the people who live here, sorry, I'm in Hollywood, so not here. That's a different story. All the people who live in Israel now uh, share some of that DNA. Who has more, who has less, depends on the group, depends on the period. But part of the Palestinian DNA does come from those ancient people. However, their culture is almost irrelevant to it. I mean, the culture that you have in the land of Israel, starting with the Muslim conquest, has very little connection to that because there were so many waves. You
Mm-hmm.
had the Hellenic wave,
Mm-hmm.
then you have the Roman wave, which is related, but it's different. The Byzantines,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have the Muslims come in. Then during the Muslim era, you have a lot of people leave, then a lot of people come from other parts of the Arab world. So you really have a mixture of Arab culture, to state the obvious, Arab DNA from other parts of the Middle East, and cultural influences that come from completely different parts of the world in completely different periods. A lot of the early religious influences on Islam in the land of Israel are Hellenic,
Mm.
like the Manichaean philosophies or things of that sort. So the links culturally to the Canaanites for Palestinians are non-existent, I would
Huh.
say. But DNA wise, yes. Meanwhile, for Jews, there's also a um, cultural link going back to the Canaanites.
Gotcha. But the Jews' DNA, like how? So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the modern Jewish Israelis largely came from Europe, as the Zionists. No, that's not
No, no,
okay.
there's two problems with that.
Sure.
Um, First of all, I'll start with the Ashkenazi Jews. Those are the
Mm-hmm.
European Jews.
Yep.
So Ashkenazi Jews have strong DNA links to the Middle East still, right? If you did a DNA test on me, I'm an
Yeah.
Ashkenazi Jew. My folks are from Lithuania and Poland
Mm-hmm.
and Ukraine. So if you did a DNA analysis on me and you did DNA analysis on an Ethiopian Jew, obviously we look very different. We both have more in common, usually not 100% of the time, with each other than I do with a Ukrainian and they would with an Ethiopian.
Oh, no kidding.
That's not Jewish. Yeah, because we had very insulated communities. So we intermarried and bred to some extent, but not all that much. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that in Israel, the majority is no longer Ashkenazi Jewish. Um, the most Ashkenazi Jews, most were killed in the Holocaust. So
Yeah.
there's actually, less of us now than there were then. And when Israel was established, most Jews there were European of origin, and the leaders were European of origin. But within 10 years, the Jews from Arab countries outnumbered the Ashkenazi Jews. And by 1967, it was a significant majority that were from Arab-speaking countries or other countries that are not Ashkenazi, like Iran, India, Turkey, and the biggest communities from Morocco and from Iraq. And there's even
Really?
documents, yeah, and there's
Huh.
even documents in 67 before the war where Israeli generals, Ashkenazi generals, were saying, can we fight a war when most of our soldiers are not Ashkenazi? They're from all these primitive countries. Are we going to be able to win wars anymore? Well, they won. They won the war really, really nicely.
Yep.
What wasn't a big problem. Then that changed a little bit in 90, 91 when the immigrants from Russia or former Soviet Union came to Israel, that was 1 million Ashkenazis showing up in Israel out of the blue. That kind of evened things up. But now the largest group in Israel is mixed. There's more people who are Mizrahi and Ashkenazi in Israel than any other group. Like I think of my group of friends, I'm 100% Ashkenazi, but that's mostly because my family's from the US.
Huh.
But when I think of my friends, most of them are mixed.
So
50-50, 75-25. That's the norm now. So it's a very Middle Eastern country.
So they started out as Ashkenazi Jews as a Zionist movement, but over the years, it became the Jewish mix became largely Arab and European.
Yeah. Now,
okay,
a lot of them would be offended if you called them Arab.
Okay, yeah,
they call them Mizrahi Jews.
How do you say that?
Mizrahi.
Mizrahi. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mizrahi. Okay, I'll make sure to get that one right.
Yeah. Just don't call them Arab and you'll be fine.
Yeah, it's touchy.
to an extent, they were the ones who are from Arab countries. Not all of them, like Persian Jews, are not Arab Jews. To the extent they were, they spoke Arabic. Right. I just was watching feuding the other day, and in there, this Mizrahi Jew, the father of the hero, Doron, says, "I'm an Arab Jew. I grew up in Baghdad," and you do hear that sometimes.
Yeah,
but a lot of them really don't like that because, unfortunately, sometimes Arab is almost a slur in Hebrew. Very unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, it's reminds me of the story of like the last two Jews in Afghanistan. Ace was where it's like they were arguing, they got sent.
They hadn't spoken together in years. They were feuding.
They were feuding. Only two Jews, and they were just in a fight constantly.
You know the joke about the Jew on the desert island?
Tell me about it.
Okay, I hope I can do it justice. It's the paradigmatic Jewish joke. So a Jew is shipwrecked, and he's the only guy who survives. And he sets up shop in the island. This guy's really resourceful. He builds all this stuff, houses, grain storage, and 2 synagogues. And he's discovered by another group of Jews, and they look at what he's built, and they're amazed. And they say, "But listen, why do you have 2 synagogues? You're only one person." So he says, "This is the synagogue I pray in every Sabbath. And this, I will never set foot there in my life."
So I don't know. Have you ever listened to Dan Carlin at all? Hardcore History.
I have.
Okay.
Yeah. He's a lot of fun.
So I love. He talks about. I think he talks about the Israelis this way, and I've known many Israelis over in my life, and I find them some of the most fascinating people. Because the Israelis are like everybody else, only more so, which is I think how Dan Carlin describes them.
I like that. I like that. I've never heard that before, but I like it.
This is right. You get it.
I do. Absolutely.
So why are Israelis, what makes Israelis like this? Like, what is the character of the Israeli and what brings them to be, and Jews almost in general? Like, what is that?
Well, I can speak to Israelis.
Yeah.
And why they're the way they are. I even have an article about it back from my academic days, or an article related to this. Basically, Jews arrive, the first Zionists arrive in the late 19th century, early 20th century. When we think of the early Zionists, what we're really talking about is a tiny group of people. About 5,000 people are the main, what we call the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration. They were the leaders of what would become Israel and the institutions that would lead to the state of Israel. When they arrived, the land was under the Ottoman Empire. It was swampy. No one was willing to sell them any land. They were dying of malaria. They weren't allowed to arm themselves. They faced a series of seemingly insurmountable problems. And also, to make matters worse, most of them had no experience in agriculture. They were or limited experience in agriculture because they had been banned from agriculture where they came from, which is mostly Russia. So they had seemingly insurmountable problems. And what they developed was a culture of directness, of problem solving at all costs, efficiency, pragmatism, and no bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
The best thing that you can say to an Israeli is that they go straight to the point. Like we have a word for it. It's called dugri. Dugri means,
Doogly.
you know,
Okay.
keeping it
Sababa.
real. Keeping it real. Yeah, well, sababa is cool, right? But dugri means keeping it real. And if you keep it real, that's the best thing that you can
Yeah.
do. And nothing's worse than being full of it. And there's nothing worse than not looking for solutions to the problem. And I would always tell my students that the difference culturally is that, so I used to teach in Canada.
Yeah.
So I tell them, okay, so Canadians, they think inside the box. Americans, they like to sometimes think outside the box.
Yeah.
Israelis don't like for there to be a box. They just don't want there to be a box. They just want to look for the most pragmatic and direct solution. And they really felt the early Zionists that they had to transform their entire identity, and they had to change everything that they'd learned from their parents, and everything was about expediency. So that really rubbed off, and that culture continues sometimes to our detriment. Because now that we have a state that is actually quite sophisticated and tries to serve the people in many ways, we don't trust it. We try to outsmart it. We try to outsmart each other. It's also very Mediterranean. Is another way of
Yeah.
looking at it. Uh, our culture is not that different from Greece, Italy, Tunisia,
Mm.
Lebanon. There's a lot of similarities. People who write books about Mediterranean culture, when they get to chapters about Israel, they don't have any problem fitting us into that culture when it comes to food, when it comes to mentality. So it's geographic and it's circumstantial.
No. Okay. So do you think, because again, this is just reasonably ignorant opinions of mine, but I've sort of have viewed Israel as like the tip of the spear of like the Western civilization, right? Because you've got this sort of westernized, at least allegiance-wise, country that's pretty militaristic, right? Like you're winning some major, surrounded by enemies on all sides, winning battles, and as far as I understand now, has become a big supplier of like spyware and stuff, like you know MI6 spy gear kind of stuff, like hacking cell phones and whatnot. Do you think
Better. Better than
better?
MI6.
Yeah, right. The MI6 is hopefully getting the Israeli stuff, right? And see that
Exactly.
that pride in your face when you
Exactly.
hear that. Like, you're like, yeah, it's way better than their shit. It's like, do you think that attitude and that practicality and that the dually, is that kind of what translates into that sort of position? Like, am I making sense here?
I didn't completely understand the okay, you talk about the military superiority or the militarism, and
Right.
then you talk about Western culture. You're saying that how is one related to the
Well,
other?
it's Israel is Western aligned, right? Like much more than it is like, say, um Arab or China, or I think actually they deal with Russia a bit, but um it's very practical. And Israel, it's no secret that like the Israeli intelligence and the United States intelligence like have relationships.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a couple things to unpack here. First, I'll talk about
Yeah.
the Western angle.
Yeah.
That's very controversial. Not that anything you said is wrong,
Yeah.
but it's a very controversial issue. One of the reasons it's a very controversial issue is that what you said is basically exactly what Islamists say about Israel. They say that Israel is, the tip of the spear of Western colonialism. Any victory by Israel is a victory of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And they point to evidence of that, that Israel sort of hatched out of the British Mandate,
Yep.
And B, that in 1956, Israel cooperated with the French and the British to try to take over the Suez Canal.
Yep.
That was sort of the great moments of Israel as a spearhead of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is kind of different
Mm-hmm.
in many ways. Um, colonialism, the idea of colonialism is that you have a mother nation that sends you to colonize, and the Zionist movement was a spontaneous grassroots movement of people who were oppressed in mostly Eastern Europe, also to a lesser degree Western Europe, who once they arrived in the land started to negotiate with imperial powers to make a deal
Oh
so that
yeah, the
they could start
practicality.
a nation. Yeah, and of course, this is pre decolonization. There's no one else to talk to. There's no one who's not an empire. You know, you'd have to go to go to Ethiopia or something to find someone who wasn't an empire. The Ottoman Empire is there.
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to take it over from the Ottoman Empire? The Russians, the Germans, and the British,
Mm-hmm.
all empires. You got to talk to an empire. There's literally no one else to talk to. Now, as far as Western culture, that's true. Um, Again, to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
The Ashkenazi Jews are the ones who at least run the Zionist movement. There are
Mm-hmm.
Zionists who aren't. And the Ashkenazi leaders, who to this day, most leaders are Ashkenazi, like Benjamin Netanyahu,
Yeah.
for example, tend to see Israel as a European state.
Mm-hmm.
The most famous quote about that is Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, called Israel a villa in the jungle, which I think is very representative of what how Ashkenazi Jews have
Yeah.
always looked at the Middle East. And Israel competes in the Eurovision Song Competition, and after being bounced out of every soccer competition in the world, now is part of the European Soccer Federation. I'm a big sports fan, so it's actually bad for us because we can't qualify against France and Spain, but we could when we. By the way, it got so bad that we were trying to qualify in with Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. When I was a kid, I used to watch us play against Papua New Guinea, and we almost qualified from there. Last time we qualified was 1970. That was when Asia still let us participate. Anyway, um, sorry, big soccer fan. So you have that Western element, but then because the Ashkenazi Jews have spent so much time in the Middle East now, and B, so many of the Jews in Israel, the majority, are either non-European or at least partially non-European. The Israeli culture at this point is very Middle Eastern in so many ways.
Hmm.
Our music is increasingly Arab sounding. The food, Israeli food, is a combination of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi food and authentic Arab food too. But about 80% of the cuisine is Middle Eastern. Like
Hmm.
only 20% is a little bit they take from Europe. And look, I mean, culturally speaking, I can't tell you how comfortable I feel when I meet an Arab. Usually not so much in Israel because there's all the, political drama. But when I meet an Arab or a Persian person abroad, I have so much more in common with them culturally, I feel, than
Hmm.
when I meet a Belgian or a Danish person.
Huh.
I mean, I just find them very cold and weird from my Israeli perspective. And if I meet an Iraqi guy, I have no problem. Like we
Huh.
immediately we speak the same cultural language in so many ways because we just have had those ties for so many years, coming from the same cultural wellspring. Um, and the Middle East starting to accept Israel now to some extent. I think
It
that the
is, right? It's kind
yeah,
of crazy. Only in the past few years, too, like 5, 6 years, it seems to have gotten quite different.
well, it came in stages,
Yeah.
it came in stages for sure. The Oslo process was one important stage,
Mm-hmm.
but this feels like more of a watershed. It couldn't
Do
have
we
happened without Oslo, but this
do
is
we give
I don't
Trump and Kushner any credit?
oh, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
Absolutely.
I don't know
Yeah.
anything about this. So.
I don't know I don't think Trump was that involved, but he did appoint Jared Kushner.
Yeah.
And Kushner, I mean, I'll start with he leveraged his business interests and his intelligence. Like he's no idiot.
I think he didn't he make like $1 billion from like the UAE or something like that, or Saudi Arabia.
Well, you wanted me to give credit. I'm anti-Trump, and I could bash Kushner and Trump this entire podcast if you want. I'm sure you don't want that, but I'm trying to give credit. Kushner put together those accords.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
was the main actor behind it. More, and I know Israelis who worked on it. They all say he was the driving force behind it.
No
Not the
shit.
Israelis,
Okay.
not the Israelis, not the State Department. Him and his personal
Wow.
ties. Yeah, he put together the entire deal, and I think that deal was great. I don't let my liberal bias tell me otherwise. And I'm glad that Israel's being accepted. It's a partial step, but it's a hell of a step.
Hmm.
And I support it, and I give Kushner credit. And I can say bad things about him all day long, but I'll give him credit. Let me tell you another thing I give Trump credit for
Okay.
that all my liberal friends almost disown me for was when he started assassinating, Iranian generals like Soleimani. When Trump assassinated
Yeah, yeah.
Soleimani, I was, I don't know if I should say this, I was ecstatic because as someone who was involved in the Israeli security apparatus to some extent, mostly I have friends that used to work in there. Soleimani was our number one enemy. We
Yeah.
were trying to kill him for years. It was the fantasy of the Mossad to kill him, and Trump did it. And people said, if you kill Soleimani, someone will just take his place. No, no, there's no other Soleimani. That guy was a brilliant, charismatic leader who knew how to unite people of different ethnicities behind a cause. And now Iran is struggling. It's struggling to have the same influence in those countries.
And
Some people are irreplaceable.
why was he such an important target? I mean, I vaguely remember this, but I don't, I never understood why it was a big deal.
Sometimes you have I'm not going to compare him to Alexander the Great or Napoleon, but
No.
sometimes you have a person who has a specific skill set that makes him an absolute menace.
Yeah.
And Soleimani was. They appointed this guy. The Iranians appointed this guy, and the Iranians are actually fairly incompetent in many many things, and we're seeing
Yeah.
that now. They appointed this guy, and they said to him, "Listen, your job is to coordinate all the militias in the Middle East that we can work with to one goal, which is two goals to cement Iranian influence throughout the um, Levant and to threaten Israel and limit Israeli influence and American
Hmm.
influence." And he went about doing that incredibly. And one of the reasons that today Iraq is so firmly in the Iranian camp, although there's some changes with that too, is because of the efforts that he made. One of the reasons that Assad won the war in Syria
Mm-hmm.
is because of the efforts that he made. He also worked very well with the Russians. He managed to bring about a situation where the Russians, even though they didn't support all the Iranian goals, cooperated with them extensively. He knew how to work with a lot of Sunni groups as well, and he was a good general. His military operations tended to be quite successful. So for Israel, he was a menace, and since he's been killed, Israeli operations in the area are going much much better, and that's thanks to Trump. So here I am doing Trump propaganda for free. So
Well, I mean, I'm no fan of Trump.
neither am I. But that was a
I
great decision, and that was his decision. That wasn't Kushner. So
no
I said something
kidding.
good about both
All
of them.
right, yeah, yeah.
I don't know if I have anything good else to say about either of them, but
Um, where to go after that one? Uh, so why is it that Iran and is what's the history behind that? Why are Iran and Israel just in such conflict, especially when you have so like Saudi Arabia is starting to get along with Israel, Egypt starting to get along with Israel, UAE? Why is Iran, which isn't even close to Israel comparatively, such a problem child?
you kind of answered the question inside your explanation. Iran's not close to the area.
Yeah.
Not only that, they don't speak the same language, and not
Right,
only
right.
that, they don't have the same religion.
Yeah.
And not and the Shiites are seen in Palestine and everywhere that's relevant as somewhere between, deeply misguided Muslims and heretics that deserve to die, depending on who you talk to. So they have a serious disadvantage in the region. So the only wedge that they've managed to latch onto is Israel by being the most anti-Israel of all the countries in the region. They can have influence and take advantage of that conflict, and they've done everything they can to exacerbate the conflict, which again gives you a hint about why we were so happy that Soleimani was killed and all that. Iran has made Israel's life absolutely miserable since the revolution, since almost immediately after. And the two most important examples are first what happened in Lebanon. Israel occupied Lebanon in 1982 after a very successful military operation. Iran managed to turn the Shiites there, who were nominally friendly to the Israeli invasion at first, because they were sick of the Sunnis and the Palestinians in the area,
Mhm.
into a militia that has been fighting Israel ever since, Hezbollah,
Yeah.
starting with the blowing up of the Marines barracks in Beirut. So exploiting anti-Americanism, exploiting anti-Israel sentiment, all that gave them a toehold in Lebanese politics, which led to them being today, in many ways, the most important actor in Lebanese politics. Like Hezbollah, what they started in the early 80s, has been the dominant force in Lebanese politics for a long time. The other thing they did, and you could almost say that they're uniquely responsible for, is the failure of the Oslo process. It's something that people don't really talk about.
Hmm.
But they funded and trained Hamas to bomb Israeli targets relentlessly, not when the occupation was at its worst, but when the peace process was at its highest ebb,
Mm.
in order to derail it, because their worst nightmare is that Israel and the Palestinians should have peace, because then they don't have a toehold in the region.
Hmm.
So they're very happy that the peace process failed. They're very happy that Hamas is now in charge of Gaza. All that gives them the opportunity to be influential in the region. They also loved the war in Syria that allowed them to be very very useful there. So they don't naturally have a stake in the Levant. So the conflict gives them the ability to slip in. Meanwhile, the local Arab states, they've had enough of fighting Israel. And one of the reasons is what you said. They're nearby. We can make their lives much more miserable than we can Iran. We have to attack Iran very indirectly.
Hmm.
And we can't leverage ethnic groups there in the same way. We tried to do that with the Kurds to some extent and had some success, but there's no comparison because we're even more foreign in Iran than they are in the Levant, right? I
Hmm.
mean, Israel is not an actor that you particularly want to be associated with.
Hmm.
So the Iranians have leverage that we don't, and we've punished the Arab states quite a lot for working against us, and that's one of the reasons that we have peace with a lot of them, or at least they don't fight us as much.
And is this so that they can extract concessions and negotiations? Is this like what do they? Is this so that they can rally their people, or how does that what are the tangible benefits for them by having the influence in the Levant?
For the Iranians,
Yes.
well, I think the best way to look at Middle Eastern politics is as if we're still in the Middle Ages or antiquity or whatever. The best way to look at Middle Eastern politics, and that includes Israel, is as a struggle for the domination of the Middle East. Um, you always have actors who want to become the top dog in the Middle East. It is, we know from historical perspective, impossible,
Mm.
essentially. There's too much opposition, there's too much of a fracturing, but that hasn't stopped everyone from trying. And if you look at the Middle East through that prism, things make a lot more sense. You have Nasser as the main contender to try to dominate the Middle East up until the late 60s. After that, you have a competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran over who can become the most influential, which led to the radicalization of the entire area. If you think of the Middle East before the 70s, political Islam existed, but it wasn't particularly powerful. What Saudi Arabia and Iran did is they funded their version of radical Islam Saudi Arabia with some more success because it was Sunni, and changed the entire region. And a lot of the Iranian military efforts were an attempt to counter the success of the Saudi soft power success, which came from the fact they had more money and that their Islam is Sunni. Then when you look at what Israel did in the early 80s with the invasion of Lebanon, that was Israel's attempt to kind of be too big for its britches. And Ariel Sharon, the defense minister at the time, had a plan to turn all the Middle East into an area of Israeli hegemony. That failed miserably. Saddam Hussein had a plan like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And the United States had a plan like that, right? You had Pax Americana. You had the wars in Iraq.
Yep.
So basically, everyone's trying to be the next Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. That's how it is. So when people talk about the Middle East and they use terms like human rights and democracy and all this stuff, it's not really the right lexicon. Actors in the region use that to some extent. Israel believes in democracy for itself, but and Lebanon does to some extent, but they're not out there trying to export this stuff. It's a dog eat dog world out there in the Middle East, and everyone is trying to get as much power as they can. And there's a reason for that. If you don't have power in the Middle East, you end up in serious trouble. I mean, look at the poor Yazidis in Iraq. Look at the Kurds until they managed to put together a military, and still in Turkey. If you're not armed, if you're not confrontational, if you're not willing to fight and win, your lifespan in the Middle East will be very short.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of like Israel is a democracy, but how does Israel maintain itself as a democracy, as a Jewish democracy, when, I mean, my understanding is that the Muslims might have more people in Israel eventually. Like, how does that work?
Oof. Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, okay. First of all, Israeli democracy right now, a lot of those of us who are in the center and the left feel like it's under threat from other Jews. So that's a separate issue. I'll put that aside.
This is literally what some of my Israeli friends had me asked you about. He was like, they're like, yeah, is Israel really going to remain a democracy? Is it moving towards a ism of some sort?
Right. So that's when I think of Israeli democracy right now, I think of those threats.
Yeah.
Not I don't think of the Arab threat right now. There is a serious issue underlying, completely unresolved, of demographics, which you alluded to. So for those people who are listening or watching and don't know the nuances, there's several categories of Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So there are Arab citizens of Israel. They're about 20% of the population of Israel. There are Arabs living in East Jerusalem, many of whom do not have an Israeli citizenship, most of whom don't, but live under Israeli rule. Then you have Palestinians in the West Bank. They live under the Palestinian Authority government, which is a autonomy government formed during the Oslo process. And then you have Palestinians living in Gaza under the government of Hamas, a pro-Iranian terrorist organization. So, if you put all these groups together and compare their numbers to the Israelis, it's similar. There's arguments over who has more. It's pretty similar. And even though Arab numbers aren't increasing as quickly as they were in the past, they're increasing faster than the Jewish numbers. By the way, Israel is the most reproductively successful Western democracy in the world. Israelis have kids, but so do the Palestinians. And the Palestinians have slightly more. It used to be like, 3 Israeli kids for 8 Palestinian kids, but contraception has become very common. So now it's a little bit more. It's like 4 to 3 or something like that. So if you put all that together, you have basically a 50-50 country. But Israel has played a game of divide and conquer intentionally, right? When Israel liberated or conquered the territories in 1967, depending on who you asked, they wanted the land, at least in the West Bank, but they didn't want the people, right? Levi Eshkol, the Israeli prime minister at the time, he said, "We want the dowry, we don't want the bride. Want the land, don't want the people." Yeah.
Wow.
So, what Israel, the reason for that is demographic.
Yeah.
So Israel has tried to find various ways to have the land that it wants and not rule all of the Palestinians, right? So that's one of the reasons a lot of people support a two-state solution.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is moral. I believe the Palestinians have a right to a state. But part of it is also that if there isn't one, then Israel is faced with two choices. Either they discriminate against all the Arabs and
Yeah.
Palestinians to the point where maybe all these accusations of apartheid actually become true.
I mean, it sure looks like it would be.
Right? Or it gives them citizenship, in which case there's no way the state can be a Jewish state.
Right. Yeah, that seems like the contradiction right there. Like
it wouldn't be anymore. There's just no way.
yeah.
You could have a state with some Jewish characteristics at best, right? But right now, the state is set up as a Jewish state in the sense that it's a haven for Jews suffering from anti-Semitism, which I believe is essential, and most Israelis do as well, including on the left. And that couldn't happen. So you have that
Yeah.
demographic tension. It's never been resolved, and I don't know if it ever will be resolved.
Right. Yeah. And what I don't know. Are you familiar with Martyr Made? He does a podcast. Daryl, I'm forgetting his last name. Anyway, he actually has the reason I'm bringing him up is because I started listening to his podcast as well, and his first 3 episodes, and I'm only like halfway through the first one, is about the formation of the state of Israel. And what I didn't realize is the magnitude of and frequency of scapegoating of the Jews in Europe and Russia besides the Holocaust. Like apparently that stuff had been going on for a long time and was even like before the Holocaust, the original motivation for the Zionists that you were talking about in the late 1800s showing up in Israel, right? Like, is that yeah.
Absolutely. And okay, so this I'm really glad you asked that because it gives me a chance to dispel a common myth
Mm-hmm.
about Zionism and about Judaism. There's a myth that Israel was created in response to the Holocaust.
Right.
It is basically completely untrue. There's
Yeah.
very little truth in that. I wouldn't say like 0%. And that's unfortunately that's the standard narrative. And I'll tell you why it's not true. A lot of it is to do with what you just said. Anti-Semitism was chronic in
Right.
Europe. You had Jews being expelled from countries in the Middle Ages, both famously Spain, but also England.
Mm-hmm.
You had slaughters of Jews throughout Europe, way before the Holocaust and nationalism. And to a great extent, you had a switch in what anti-Semitism meant in the modern era, from religious to scientific, to based on Darwinian principles to based on racial principles. But anti-Semitism was always there. But it's actually not the Western European anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that launched the Holocaust eventually, that led to the formation of the State of Israel, or at least led to the creation of the Zionist movement. It was the anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. It was the anti-Semitism in Russia,
Yeah.
and to a lesser extent in Poland. So you had the czars at the time were undergoing incredible pressures to liberalize, democratize, socialize, depending on who was pressing them in what direction. That led to reforms in 1905 and led to the collapse of the entire Tsarist Empire in 1917. One of the best ways that they could unite people was by blaming the Jews for all problems. That was something everyone could agree on, is that the Jews suck, right? So you could unite the Ukrainians, and you could unite the workers, and you could unite people from the Tartars and everyone against the Jews, and so you had pogroms.
Pogroms,
Um,
that's the word I was forgetting. Yeah, yep.
yeah, regularly. And if you
And
look at
what is a
the
pogrom?
what's a pogrom? A pogrom is it's just a good old fashioned. It's not dissimilar to what happened to the African American community in Tulsa, for example. You get
Yes, okay.
together all the racists and you come down
Black
and
Wall
you
Street. Yeah,
yeah exactly, and you destroy the shops, you kill the men, you rape the women,
yeah,
and Jews weren't allowed to hold weapons,
yep,
so they couldn't fight. They couldn't fight back, and they felt very powerless.
yep.
And so the vast majority of the early Zionists came from these communities. Now, the most famous one is the most famous early Zionist is Theodor Herzl, who's Western European. But if you look at the people who were in the early Zionist congresses, they came vast majority came from Eastern Europe. And Pinsker and other people wrote about Zionism before Herzl discovered. Herzl was just very charismatic, and he became the leader of the movement. And the early Zionists who arrived came from the communities that suffered pogroms. They personally suffered pogroms.
Right.
Almost all of them had personal experience with this. And the early Zionist poets wrote about their experiences in pogroms, right? The famous one is Chaim Nachman Bialik, who wrote about that. Um, he said all of the world is a gallows for the Jews, is what he
Yeah.
wrote about.
I mean,
About the
one of the things Daryl talks about in his episode is like that during the pogroms, like the Western media would cover some of these things and they would describe the horrors, but they would even say the censors will not allow us to print what would happen. Like pretty bad shit, apparently. Like,
the worst stuff you can imagine
yeah.
happened. It was a period of a lot of barbarism. It
Mm-hmm.
was the same period where the Armenian genocide was taking place,
Mm-hmm.
and it was the same period when Germany was conducting its own genocide in Namibia.
Mm.
A lot of the antecedents of the Holocaust were found in this time, and the United States actually had a fairly good role. They were the only country, or that I'm aware of, probably there were others too, that took an active interest in trying to convince the Russians not to do this sort of thing,
Mm.
and they also took an active interest in the Armenian genocide. So yeah, it was reported in American newspapers more than just about anywhere else, and the American government took more of an interest in it,
Mm.
than just about anyone else. So that's a point of pride for for the United States. So because the roots of Zionism come from those early pogroms, and we're talking about a good 50, 60 years before the Holocaust. And we're talking,
Yeah.
the big ones are in 1896 and 1905, but there were a lot of smaller ones too. And so they're already building the future Jewish state and already got the Balfour Declaration and already formed the first military organizations, the workers' unions, the healthcare corporations, everything that is still in Israel today, they already formed. All of that was already there by the time the Holocaust started.
Mm.
What the Holocaust did was both good and bad for Zionism. It
Right.
was bad for Zion. It was terrible for the Jews, obviously, but for Zionism, it was bad for the Zionism because it killed all these Jews that could have been potential Zionists. Many of them
Right.
were, especially in Poland. Right-wing Zionists, by the way. The most popular movement in Poland was Beitar, which today is the Likud.
Mm.
So my
Right.
my grandparents are Polish on my father's side. So my grandfather was a communist, but my
Yeah.
grandmother was Beitar, so she was a revisionist right-wing Zionist. After the Holocaust, none of that seemed to matter anymore, so they married. But before, they probably wouldn't have gotten along at all. Um, and Israel lost a lot of possible officers who could have come and fought with it.
Yeah.
What it did do for Israel is that it promoted awareness of the plight of anti-Semitism to a
Right.
level that it hadn't been before. So you had a lot of headlines. You have the story of Exodus is based on some of these ships that were sent back to Germany, or the people were interned in camps that looked a lot like concentration camps in Cyprus by the British. It's one of the reasons the British left is because people were comparing them constantly to Nazis, and it was a bad look.
Yeah.
Um, it helped with public opinion to some extent. But when you actually look at the report in 1948, by the UN, by UNESCO, that recommended the partition, recommended the creation of a Jewish state, they barely mentioned the Holocaust.
Yeah.
They looked at the location of Jewish communities. They looked at their economic strength. They looked at their military strength. They said that that the Jews have built an infrastructure for a state. They basically create facts on the ground. And then, of course, the partition was ignored by the Arab world, or I should say, rebelled against by the Arab world. Every Arab state invaded Israel. Israel had to beat them off militarily. And not only did the Holocaust not help rally the world around the Zionist cause, but the major Western countries boycotted Israel. They had a tripartite declaration: don't sell arms to anyone involved in this war. The British, the French, and the Americans signed it. The British broke it extensively to arm the Arabs, but no one was arming Israel except for the Russians. That's a different story. They armed them to piss off the British, and that's how Israel survived, through Czechoslovakia.
I was also my notes here have that, you know, the young men who had gone through the pogroms and like had that suffering, it's like they were either going to become Zionists or they would go to the Russian Revolution, become Bolsheviks. Like, and there was this tension there between which way are you going to go, young man?
Absolutely. And the two are intimately related. Now, what I'm about to say is going to feed into some conspiracy theories, but it's still historically true. Um, the problem of anti-Semitism in the 19th century was so severe for Jews, because the reason the 19th century was such a disappointment is because when Napoleon comes to power and makes sure that all the laws are equal for Jews in France, there's incredible hope among Jews that they turn the corner, that anti-Semitism is not so much over. It's like a Barack Obama moment, incredible hope.
Mm.
Then that was shattered by the rise of a new.
How did that hope turn out?
Yeah, how's that?
How's that hope doing
What
now?
did Palin say? How did that hopey changey stuff work out for you?
Changey stuff, yeah.
Exactly.
Great Nobel Peace Prize, Barack. Anyways, go on.
Yeah. So, yeah, hope is anyway. So, the new anti-Semitism that arose as a response to the fact that Jews were able to get jobs and get ahead was actually in many ways worse and more violent, as manifested eventually in the Holocaust. And so the sense among most Jews was, this can't go on. Like, we need to solve this. And different Jews had different reactions. The two main revolutionary reactions were communism and Zionism.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Karl Marx wasn't speaking as a Jew officially, but why was Karl Marx out there trying to cancel nationalism? Why was Karl Marx out there trying to cancel religion? He didn't want to be persecuted. To me, that's the possibly subconscious, possibly conscious motive of Marx and all of these Jewish revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky and so many others. I think that was their solution. And Zionists had a different solution, a nationalist solution. Both did a lot to change the world. Only one, in my opinion, did anything to improve the status of Jews or the world in general, and it was Zionism. But yeah, communism, I think, is definitely an attempt to solve anti-Semitism, and there's other examples of that. In the Middle East is a great example. There's a movement in the Middle East called Pan-Arabism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard of that.
And the idea behind Pan-Arabism is, it doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Christian. All that matters is you're Arab. We're one people with one heritage.
Yeah.
And who invented that? Arab Christians. They invented the Pan-Arab philosophy because it eliminated the fact that they were being discriminated against and treated badly by Muslims by saying, it doesn't matter that we're Christians. We're all Arabs. And communism is a way of saying, it doesn't matter that we're Jews. We're all workers. It's a similar, at least subconscious impulse. Of course, so many communists were not Jews, but I think that's why it was so attractive to Jews.
Sure.
And that's why my grandparents, one was a revisionist Zionist and one was a communist. It really represents those impulses.
Weird for you here. Let's bring this in a slightly different direction here.
All right.
Was Jeffrey Epstein Mossad?
I certainly hope not. I listen. I don't pretend to know what the Mossad is doing, but I seriously doubt it.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So I sent you one other thing, the Balenciaga thing. Now,
Oh yeah,
so the reason I wanted to ask you about this was because I'd never even heard of Balenciaga before this whole thing went down.
same.
And I was like, okay, there's this fashion brand, and like they've got, for our listeners here, in case you don't know it, they did this photo shoot with this I forget it was the producer or director or something like that, had like very weird like BDSM sort of stuff with like kids in their portfolio, and like
It's a strange ad.
really, really strange. And they had these teddy bears and bondage gears with these kids, and like this one particular, and I'll try to make sure I edit this in so people can see the picture, but they had this tape roll with Baal, it's spelled Balenciaga, but Baal. And the reason I'm asking our friend here, Shaiel, today about this is he goes on in one of his podcasts, starts talking about Baal being one of the gods of the Canaanites. And specifically, he talks about that there's Baal is known in modern terms for child sacrifice. But you don't think that that's the case. So I kind of wanted to get whatever you want to talk about in terms of this. Like, who was Baal? Like, what's the modern mixed conception about this? And what, you have any idea what Balenciaga is up to?
Yeah, I mean, I could just speculate. Okay, so starting with Baal. Baal is, I would say, probably the most important Canaanite god of all.
Okay.
I would stipulate that as saying that probably in an era before we have records, El was the most important god. El still survives in the sources we have as the Zeus of the pantheon,
Mm.
but he's just not discussed all that much. It's his his son Baal is discussed a lot more. And then in some versions, it looks more like Baal isn't so much El's son as much as the new representation of El. And then he's the Zeus. So we don't
Mhm.
the family tree's a little murky, especially since there's no like one authority on it. So he's either the son of the Zeus or the Zeus of the pantheon. He's a very useful god for agricultural societies. Won't surprise you, he's the god of rain, so if you have a drought, he's the guy you go to. So
Right.
my belief is that Baal went over El because El, kind of like Zeus, was a thunder guy, and storms are a lot more useful if you're an agriculturalist than thunder, to put it mildly. So so people just went straight to the sun, kind of like Christianity did,
Yeah.
or something like that. And he certainly was the most popular, at least male god. There's Baal, and then there's the Asherah. That's the female goddess of fertility in Canaan during the time of the Bible, and we know this without any doubt for two reasons. First, the archaeology shows that he had more temples than anyone else, and second, man, the Old Testament Tanakh is obsessed with this guy. He appears so often. He's the nemesis. He's
Yeah.
the he's the Israelite God for religious reasons. I won't say his name. That's his personal nemesis,
Mm.
and and to the point where if you the best way to understand a lot of the commandments in the Torah is as opposition to Baal.
Mm.
You don't do what he did. You do the opposite of what he did. It gets that extreme. That's why you have, for example, the golden calf,
Yep.
because he's associated with cows. He loved cows. He even liked to have sex with cows and anything. So worshiping a cow is the worst thing you could possibly do. Just as an example. Now, if you read several passages in the Tanakh, they talk about how children were sacrificed to Baal, especially in Gay Ben Hinnom, which is a valley in Jerusalem, not far from where I grew up. That was the center of it. Now, the archaeological digs haven't shown any sign whatsoever of child sacrifice in Canaan from anyone. Not from Canaanites, not from Israelites, not anyone. The textual evidence is significant if you look at the Tanakh. Not only is there a lot of talk about Canaanites sacrificing children, but also of wayward Israelites sacrificing children to Baal. And this I get into a lot in the podcast, there's a lot of implication that early Israelites sacrificed their children to the Israelite God. Most famously in the story of Isaac and Abraham, where
Right.
a lot of experts, there's no consensus on this, but a lot of experts believe that story was an attempt to say, okay, this era now religion is over. We
Okay.
don't sacrifice children anymore. We don't do that anymore. We're moving on to something else. That's completely taboo now. But there's enough clues aside from that child sacrifice was part of the Israelite tradition that a lot of archaeologists and historians believe that did happen both among Israelites and Canaanites. But the evidence is textual. It's not archaeological. Now, having said that, there is archaeological evidence that children were sacrificed to Baal. It's just not in Canaan.
Oh,
It,
okay. So children were sacrificed to Baal, but it just wasn't a Canaanite phenomenon. It was another region.
yes. So Baal was exported to Carthage by the Phoenicians.
Okay.
The Phoenicians are part of, the Levantine family. They emerge from Lebanon. They're Canaanite Philistine combo of some sort. And they move out throughout all of the Mediterranean, just like the Greeks and the Romans did, and just as successfully at first. That's why they were the Romans' rivals. That's why the Romans had to beat them twice and salt the earth to make sure they don't come back,
Right.
because they were tough. They were
Yeah.
tough. We don't have a lot of records from written records of theirs, but what they did find on several Punic islands, that's what we call the offshoot of the Phoenician culture that is related to Carthage. We found shrines, talking about we are sacrificing our children to the gods, basically, with a whole bunch of dead children that had been burnt. It's incontrovertible evidence. Like,
Okay.
some people said, oh, they were sick or whatever, but no, they're healthy kids. They were sacrificed to Baal.
Wow.
And that leads me to believe that there probably was sacrifices to Baal in Canaan as well, probably on a lesser magnitude. It was probably less central. Otherwise, why would it be mentioned in the Tanakh? And why do we have evidence of them sacrificing the same God somewhere else, albeit in a very different culture? So that's what I'll say about that. My guess is eventually we'll find some evidence of it, or something like that. People are finding new things all the time.
Right. I
My
mean,
guess
yeah,
is,
absent
yeah,
of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Like
absolutely.
yeah.
I think we have enough evidence to say it was not very central. It was probably just very shocking to the people who didn't like it, because they were people too and they loved their children. So
Right. Like,
one incidence, yeah. So if there was a cult in Gay Ben Hinnom, for example, which is what they mentioned in the Tanakh, I don't know if that really did, that would sacrifice a child now and then, that would probably attract a lot of attention, especially when that was no longer central to either religion. So it could have been very rare instances that got a lot of attention. That would be my guess, considering we don't have evidence of it.
now I
Now,
mhm.
yeah.
Now
Now, why?
I tend to believe that religious practices have practical purposes, generally speaking, right? Especially ones that go far and wide, right? You have fasting. Fasting, obviously, I think has health benefits for people, right? Like, there's the 10 Commandments. Pretty practical advice if you want to get along with your neighbors in many ways.
No doubt, yeah.
The success of these things, like these ideas, these memes, help the fitness and survivability of the people who practice them. And many. Do you have any sense why child sacrifice would be a thing? Like, why this was something that was done at all? Because my gut reaction is you're eliminating your population and potential supporters, like people who are going to, grow up and be in your armies or what have you, your workers on your fields. Like, what would you do this for?
Well, I can only speculate. I have
Yeah.
read a little bit on it, but that's speculation too, because we don't have access to what they were thinking. But I look at it on two levels. I'll start with pragmatic, because that's what you're emphasizing. I agree that to some extent a lot of these things have pragmatic reasons. I would say that most likely children were sacrificed in moments of great distress when you really needed the attention of the gods to save your community, or at least that's what people felt. And if you want to look at it pragmatically, they probably were thinking it's a mouth less to feed.
Yeah.
These were not times, I believe, when you had plenty of food. So sacrificed a child had a pragmatic element. If you needed a bunch of manpower to fight the Romans, you were probably sacrificing less of your male children.
Right.
I'm guessing. On a religious level, it makes perfect sense because you're giving it's the ultimate sacrifice. You're showing your absolute commitment
Right.
to this God. There's nothing I wouldn't do for this God. And if you actually believe that the God is answering your prayers, which this is kind of proof that they did, then you would think that that's the best way to get the reaction that you want from the gods. That's on a theological and pragmatic level. So I can see why that would be something that some societies would do in moments of distress. Now, you pointed out why it's not the best strategy in general, and I think that's why we don't see that as a central part of cultures anywhere
it just feels like
regularly sacrifice your
you
children.
can't outcompete your neighbors if you're getting rid of your offspring. That just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, and that's why it's rare. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the fact that we find these instances on islands is because there was no immediately threatening neighbor. That's another possibility.
Oh, that's interesting.
These were islands where we found this.
I mean, an island can only, if I'm speculating here, obviously, but you have a much more limited, if you're only getting your resources from the island and the surrounding sea, you have a much more limited population that can exist on that island.
Exactly. So on a pragmatic level, I guess we can see where that logic comes from. Again, it's not a very common logic. We don't see a lot of cultures. We see human sacrifice is pretty common among humans, but
yeah,
sacrificing your own children on a regular basis is not something that most societies do.
Oh, I mean, I think to me it makes much more sense from a pragmatic point of view to sacrifice somebody who is, not an ally of yours,
like the Aztecs did.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like the Aztecs, right?
That makes a lot more sense.
It's like you
helped us win the war. Now we'll sacrifice the victims of the war you helped us win. Terrible, but I get that.
I get a lot of terrible things. Sacrificing your own children, I don't like really.
I can't wait for this to get out. Shaiel justifies human sacrifice.
We're justifying human sacrifice on this show today, kids. How can you integrate this into your religious practices and show results into your culture in the future?
It didn't work for the Aztecs, kids. They ended up losing. Yeah.
Now, do you know anything about the Aztec? Are you into that stuff?
I mean, I've read about the Aztecs. I'm no expert. I probably know as much or less than you do.
Okay. I won't query you on that one, but I would. I find that I've heard some crazy stories about the Aztecs and just the Spanish showed up and they found hell on earth basically over there.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of that from people who are justifying the genocide that happened in Mesoamerica. They rely on some of these Spanish propaganda to say, they had it coming. And
well, that's exactly what I've heard too. And I'm wondering, I would love to talk to somebody who knew what was up there.
Find the guy who's doing the podcast on that, because I'll watch
History of the Land of Mexico.
Because that would be interesting. But of course, I do know enough to say there's no justification for genocide, and leave it at that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So let me ask you this, turn this in a slightly different direction. You know, what has been, we'll start with, what has been like the thing that you think you've learned most from doing this podcast? Like how has your thinking changed from the time that you started this to the time that you are now?
I think I have a lot more respect for people I had a lot less respect for, or thought of in very, very abstract ways. You know, you think of those pagans, you think of all those, you know, those scribes who were making up stories. You
Yeah.
think of all those nutty Egyptians with their afterlife cultish obsessions. And what you really start to see is how sophisticated the worldviews were, how deep the philosophies were, how they found solutions to incredible problems in circumstances we can't even imagine. I mean, in so many ways, these people were superior to us. We'd
Mm.
be helpless in these circumstances. And some of their ideas were so good that we're still just trying to figure them out and live by them today.
Mm.
So if there's anything I've learned, it's to respect the old school Israelites, Egyptians, Canaanites, Amorites. I Good job, guys. You know, they built the civilizations that we have all come from, and I don't think that they made more mistakes than we do. Probably about the same amount.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel that the more that I study religion and history, the 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 less modern hubris I feel like I have. Like the wisdom, yeah, the wisdom that these people had over the years is worth contemplating deeply, and not being dismissive as, oh, it's just hocus pocus magical thinking.
Agreed. Agreed. And maybe also the other tendency is that us historians tend to have sometimes of looking at today as worse somehow is the other extreme we sometimes go to. Maybe we need to remember we're also doing the best we can in very difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some of the things right now that we don't even fully understand will have an incredible amount of value in the future. So it really puts things into perspective. And of course, there's just the thing that we all know, but the more you deal with history, the deeper you feel it. Because the difference between sort
Yeah.
of knowing something and feeling it, and that is that everything's already happened to some extent.
Yeah.
These situations have already occurred in different contexts, and there's just so much that we can learn. And I just find that because I know a lot of history, when I enter into a conversation with people about modern politics, very often there's such a gap to bridge of knowledge because I'm
Yeah.
you know I need them to know all this stuff to understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where the podcast comes in. It's trying
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
bridge
Yeah. I
some of
mean,
that
that's one of the reasons I find
knowledge.
these conversations so fascinating. I mean, that because uh, that change in philosophy, change in knowledge, and what sparked it, I find absolutely, absolutely fascinating topic. Because I mean, my personal philosophy has changed quite a bit over, like the past 20 years. And for example, I used to think, what the hell is Israel doing there? Clearly they came in and they took the land from the people and blah blah blah. And then, at some point I came to the conclusion, I'm like, I support the Israelis because I have friends who are Jews and Israelis. And fuck the rest of it. Because when it comes down to it, it's kind of just you're on the team with the people who are on your team, right? Like, history, I don't know. You can tell the story a lot of different ways.
Yes, exactly. And then, of course, once you understand the topic really well, not that I necessarily know any topics as well as I should, you start to have a lot of humility about other things.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned the Aztecs. Sure, I could spout off something about the Aztecs. I don't know anything about the
Yeah.
Aztecs. If I sat and did this amount of research into the Aztecs, then I could say something coherent, possibly. But I you just realize how little you know and how much you rely on stereotypes
Yeah.
for your knowledge, not you specifically, all of us, on on any other region, any topic that we don't really fully understand. And you know what? Going against the spirit of the times, it's also given me a lot of respect for the experts and the archaeologists, and the professors and the scribes and all the people who, in both in 21st century woke academia and Middle Ages, sitting in monasteries writing things down. These people really tried hard, and they had their limitations, but boy, the job they've done, and the critical thinking that so many of them have executed, and every episode of my podcast, or any historical podcast, is standing on the shoulders of the work of so many brilliant, dedicated people who really do their jobs well. And really, thank you to all of them throughout the ages.
Nice, nice. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so beyond just the podcast, you describe yourself as you know, I think you used the word liberal.
Yeah, I'm a liberal Zionist.
Liberal Zionist.
We exist.
And if I also did detect a slight amount of contempt for the woke in there.
No,
No, okay.
I consider
professor.
I consider myself liberal and not progressive.
Okay.
And that means that I have some important differences. You may have noticed when I talked about Israel, I took from a security standpoint.
Yeah. This is what I'm trying to tease apart here. Yeah.
I have a Darwinistic view of international politics.
Yeah.
I believe in the American military. I support our troops.
Yep.
I believe in capitalism.
Yep.
Free markets, all that. But I don't have the allergy to wokeness or pronouns or any of that a lot of people on the right have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't particularly want to deal with the politics of gender, but I find myself doing it a lot, because I feel like there are certain segments of society that are being persecuted in ways that are alarming right now. I'm talking about the trans community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, like, I agree with a lot of the causes that woke people support,
mm-hmm.
but I have very little attraction for the language and performance
Mm-hmm.
behind it. And I disagree with them on certain things, like what I just said. That's why I consider myself a liberal. I vote, to put it bluntly, I vote for Biden, not for Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
Or I used to vote for John McCain. I support like a robust American foreign policy and free markets, but I also generally support, a lot of left-wing social causes.
Gotcha. Interesting. And
in Israel, I never voted for Meretz or Labor.
I mean,
I used to vote Likud when I was young.
Oh yeah.
I used to work for Benjamin.
So you went from Israeli right wing to more classical liberal, I would describe it, in the United States.
Well, here's the thing. The Likud is called the Nationalist Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's called the Nationalist Liberal Party is because it was a union of the Revisionist Party, which I talked about my grandmother belonging to, and the Israeli Liberal Party.
Mm-hmm.
And the man who created the Likud, Menachem Begin, was a classic 19th century liberal, called himself a liberal, mm-hmm. Supported equal rights for Arabs in the country, even supported what you would today call activist judges. He was very big on civil liberties in the classic sense. So I grew up supporting the side of the Likud that was liberal, a side of the Likud that Benjamin Netanyahu once belonged to, and that included a lot of other people that probably won't mean all that much to your non-Israeli listeners, like Moshe Arens or Menachem Begin's son Benny Begin, Dan Meridor, a lot of other people who are liberals. The Likud has changed since then. Has become more populist, like the right wing everywhere. I've definitely moved somewhat to the left. A lot of that was trying to, researching Israel, and also trying to explain Israeli positions abroad when I work as a diplomat. made me realize that there's some things we can explain, some things we can't. And that there's
Hmm.
some things that seem all right when you're on the ground in Jerusalem, and that don't really um, fly when you try to look at it a little bit more objectively. And then, of course, the demographic element we talked about. I don't particularly want Israel not to be a Jewish state or um, to become an apartheid state.
Hmm.
And I would never consider in the United States. I would never consider voting Republican as long as it's the Trump populist wing
Hmm.
of the party, and that's pretty much the only wing in control right now. If the Republican Party ever comes back to itself, I would give it a second thought. I'm a big fan of Liz Cheney's. I even have a T-shirt of hers.
Hmm.
So those are my politics. But I don't have a contempt for wokeness as much as I find it somewhat comical, but I don't hate it.
Well, that's good. You are living in LA, so that would be very uncomfortable.
LA is uh, LA is not as progressive and as people think that it is. The Rick Caruso almost won the election here because a
Hmm.
lot of people want the police to be stronger. They want to throw the homeless people off the streets. They don't want to build homeless shelters anywhere near them. Not in my backyard.
Yeah, yeah.
The local politics here are. This is not San Francisco.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, the way people talk about homeless people in LA is frightening and dehumanizing. I would say not everyone, but way more people than you'd think.
Hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. It's I mean, I visited down there. My brother lives in LA, Sherman Oaks area.
Yeah, it's in the
Um,
valley. Yep,
in the valley. Okay, yeah. I don't know LA that well enough.
nice
And
neighborhood. Not too many homeless people.
not the yeah, no, the tent there's a lot of tents down there. It's pretty overwhelming. It's right. I mean, up here,
Yeah,
I'm in Seattle, and it's a little bit harder to live, but there's a lot of tents. And during COVID, it was some parks that were nice to go to became completely
yeah.
overrun.
I've been to Seattle recently. You have some similar problems, but not on the same scale. The only city
Yeah.
with the same scale is San Francisco.
Oh, I mean, San Francisco was just it was Mad Max territory. It was just unbelievable. I went to somewhere in the Mission, and like just I could recognize at least three different forms of taking drugs being done in open air, from a distance. I was like, whoa, this is different.
Yes, I live in Hollywood. I'm aware. It's not as bad, and I don't have any solutions, sadly.
That was my next question, like, because I
I
I
mean, to me, the only thing I could
I'm
say
more of the
is,
dehumanist. Like, I just think men in spears and swords need to go in there and like clear things out.
well, no, I'm definitely the opposite. I would even go. I mean, I think one of the main problems is that in order to get there's housing. We pay a lot of taxes, and there's housing. I have a
Yeah.
friend who works in this field in the municipality. One of the main problems is that they want people to be completely clean from drugs before they move them in, and
Mm,
that seems to be very unrealistic.
yeah.
Yeah, I think probably better is to move them in without preconditions and try to, and except for counseling or something
What do you do when they
along those
ruin the
lines.
property?
Yeah, I know. I've heard all the counter arguments.
They start
Like I
stealing the
said, I don't
copper
have
out
good
of the
solutions.
wires. Walls.
I don't have good solutions.
Yeah. This is the liberal unfortunateness of I always find it's like there's some situations where it's like the situation has to be worse than what the people have right now, right? Like the alternative has to be worse than living on the street in order to convert people over. I mean, I don't have any good solutions. I have
Yeah.
none. There's no nice things that I've been able to come up with that remove people from tent cities.
I mean, I do my best. I volunteer in the community.
Yeah.
I try to help, but I have no solutions. This is above my pay grade. Just give me the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The simple stuff.
Like some of the same
But,
principles.
well, in some ways that's so much more simple. At least for me, this is stuff I really don't understand. I didn't grow up with any of this. I grew up in Jerusalem in the 80s.
Yeah.
We didn't have homeless people.
Well,
I remember a news edition when they said there's a hungry child in Bet Sha'an, in it's a city in the north. She
yeah.
has nothing to eat, and that was like leading leading the news. And that's what our society was like. It was very egalitarian, had a lot of elements of socialism, and
Yeah.
it wasn't very rich at that time. Capitalism kicked in the '90s, but there weren't homeless people or hungry people. If there were, you'd find the person and you'd solve the problem.
Yeah. And
It's amazing to me how it's spiraled.
how many people live in Israel?
Well, right now it's close to 9 million.
9 million or so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is it's a problem of scale, right? Back in the 80s, how many people were in Israel?
Uh, five, four.
5 million. Yeah.
Mhm.
You at some point you have you have a small enough population and everybody has enough things in common that you feel like you're in it together. I think one of the problems in the United States is that there isn't that collective sense of like we're all in it together, and there's clearly some people who are willing to not do take advantage of the systems and whatnot as much as possible, and not participate. And you have this like this want to be empathetic and take care of people as though they're your family, and treat them well. At the same time, too many people who are not going to participate in a positive way.
Well, part of it is the size for sure,
Yeah.
but part of it's the culture. I mean, I've lived in not too many countries. This is like the fifth country I've lived in for a certain amount of time. Fourth, it's definitely the least community oriented and
Yep.
united. I mean, and just the idea of the rugged individualism is so hardwired into American society that aside from the size, it adds another layer of isolation. That's one of the reasons I think that you
Yeah.
have so much violence here and mental illness here, because we're community oriented creatures,
Yeah.
uh, and rugged individualism has spurred America to great heights, but it's also damaged the social ties by
Yeah.
definition and by intention.
I think that's absolutely true. Like, especially when it's a very weird dynamic in the United States, because you have all of the quote unquote elites end up going to college, and they quite frequently go off to college at a place that's far from their homes. And then they move and they get jobs quite frequently in places that like they don't have any roots on. So you get this disparate sort of fractionalization of people without roots within a community coming in, and that sense of community is just really gone. And my wife and I, neither of us are from Seattle, and we don't have family nearby. And when we had our first kid 6 months ago, and
Congratulations.
thank you, it's great. And we joined this group of other new parents just because we wanted to have a community that was doing the same sort of things. And it was baffling to me. It's like, why in the world are we organizing our lives like this? It
Well, the
just
lack of community.
it just and I think it's endemic, like you were saying. And it's not just the scale, it's just how we expect to live our lives, and what's been normalized. I find it very odd. And I'm
Yeah,
smack down in the middle of it. I participated in it like this for 20-30 years now.
and you can't argue with the results the United States has had on a creative level. It's
Yeah.
absolutely astounding. Some of that is geography,
Yeah.
but
I
some of
mean,
that is that exact spirit that we're criticizing.
yeah.
So it has a duality, um, but it's very harmful. It's
And
very definition of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, for sure. It's very, but is Israel, on the other hand, it's like it has a lot of that creative impulses, and I think because just like the United States, the people who went there, at least for the Jews, were the adventurous spirit. You were leaving somewhere and going on a great adventure to build something, and the kind of people that attracts are different kinds of people.
Yeah, and the kind of people who rise to the top in that kind of adversity are a certain kind of people as well. Yeah,
At
we
least in
managed to
the first
achieve
few
some of that.
generations. Yeah.
Yes. Well, still, I mean, there's a reason Israel's high tech is so
Yeah.
it's so successful. Um, and military strategic thinking is still very high level. And yeah, Israel has more academic publications per person than any other country in the world.
You have taxi drivers in Israel. You have to have like a master's degree from what I hear.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I've had Uber drivers. I mean, if you believe what they tell you, anyway, I've had Uber drivers here with all kinds of achievements.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well, Shaiel, is there anything else we should be talking about?
Well, I would like to plug my second podcast. I
Oh
do have
yeah,
another podcast
absolutely.
now. I don't know why I'm doing so many podcasts, but
You
my
got
other one's
another
called.
one. Awesome.
I have another one. It's called Israel Explained.
Israel
And,
Explained. Okay.
and what I'm doing there is, all the questions that everyone keeps asking me about Israel. Um, I try to answer them there. So I did one on is there going to be another Intifada, another Palestinian uprising? Now I'm doing one on the judicial reform. Oh, we should probably talk about that before we go about the judicial. You said someone asked about that.
Oh, tell me about it.
Oh, okay. So at some point in our conversation, we were talking about whether Israel is going to remain a democracy.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
And right now, there's a lot of concern over a suggested package of reforms by the Netanyahu government.
Hmm.
The Netanyahu government is suggesting the following changes. One, about how Supreme Court judges are elected, that they should be elected only by politicians, when currently there's a combination of politicians and judges and the Lawyers Guild. The other is to remove the ability of the Supreme Court to overturn any laws made by Knesset, made by the parliament, and also to remove um, the reasonability clause, which is another mechanism by which the Supreme Court says that laws aren't reasonably applied or phrased. So basically, removing the most of the tools of judicial oversight over legislation, which the people who support it say it's because there's activist judges who legislate from the bench, something very familiar for the United States. They also say that the judges are unrepresentatively left wing.
Mm.
Those who are against it, including myself, they say that the only check and balance on the government is the Supreme Court, because in Israel, we only have one chamber of parliament, and there's no separation between the executive and the legislative arm of government, because it's the same. You have a coalition that is selected in the Knesset, in the parliament, and they run the executive. You take members
Right.
from those parties and you put them in charge of the various executive ministries. So it's removing the only check and balance on the government. So people ask all the time, is this going to end up challenging Israeli democracy? And the answer to that is that it makes it very easy for the executive to challenge and undermine democracy if it wants to.
Yeah.
Very similar to, and we don't have it's not theoretical. The most similar cases are Hungary and Poland,
Mm.
and to a lesser extent Turkey, where they did similar things
Mm-hmm.
to the judicial branch, and the results were not an complete abolition of democracy, but democracy is hollowed out to a great extent.
Mm. I mean, it certainly sounds like, from what you described, that not having judicial oversight would lead you in a tyrannical direction, or possibly.
Yes, and the main counter argument, just to be fair, focuses on the flaws of the justices and their approach, which are some of the criticisms are warranted, but you can make a lot of the same criticisms against the U.S. Supreme Court, but you wouldn't want to remove its constitutional oversight role in the United States. And if you did, by the way, the results would be less severe because you have the separation between the executive and the legislative branch, and the legislative branch is divided in a bicameral Congress. So the damage to the United States, if you took away the Supreme Court's constitutional oversight, would be terrible, but it wouldn't be as bad.
Yeah.
So that's my take on it anyway. If you want more, listen to Israel Explained.
Israel Explained. Are you going to have now? What's your format of this podcast going to be? Is it just going to be you reading off questions that are submitted? Like,
well, I give in-depth dives into topics right now. I am answering questions, especially on this one, because people are asking me a lot of questions about this topic. But I think this is a good format for interviews. So I think I'll start bringing in people to interview once I have it going better. So far I have 3 episodes, 4th one's coming out tomorrow.
Okay, I had no idea. I'll definitely check that out. How long are the episodes?
Shorter. They're like 20 something minutes, like 23 minutes.
Bite size.
Bite size.
Nice,
yes.
Nice. Cool. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. So what else anything else we should be talking about?
No, I think that covers all the bases, unless you have any more questions.
I think I've gone through my list and more, so this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming on the Furrowed Brow.
It's been a pleasure. This was even more fun than I expected.
Awesome. I mean, hopefully we can do it again, and we can do more Ask An Israeli questions, and we can dive into it. We'll see what kind
anytime you want, as long as you don't ask me about the Aztecs.
Cool, man. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.